Thanks everyone for attending the fourth lecture of this cycle on contemporary political topics organized by the PhD on political science and with support of the Praxis Research Center. Well, I hope that this lecture and the debate around the topic so important for us will be productive for all. Well, today you will have as guest speaker Joaquín Valdivielso Navarro, and as a moderator, Diogo Ferreira, a PhD student of political science. I thank you both for accepting the invitation, and well, immediately I give the word to Diogo. Diogo, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for assisting this presentation that I believe it's going to be a fruitful one. So the title of this presentation is Justice in Environmental Politics. It will be presented by Dr. Joaquín Valdivielso Navarro, as Professor Maria has already stated. He is an associate professor of moral philosophy at the Department of Philosophy and Social Work from the University of the Balearic Islands. The research that Dr. Joaquín focuses more is about contemporary moral and political philosophy and critical theories of society, ethics, and politics of environments. He also has been invited research, among others, for the new School of Social Research of the New School of University in New York and the School of Politics, International Relations and Environment at the Keele University in the UK. Author of more than 50 scientific publications, and of course, selection of contributions available at several investigation and research sites. So the title of the presentation, as I said, is about just environmental politics, which the aim of the presentation will be to map the constellation of current debates on the relationship between justice and environmental politics in contemporary political philosophy and green political theory, where justice has been a key topic on this environmental politics since its very beginning in both political, practical, and theoretical fields. And with all that being said, the presentation will take about 15 minutes, more or less. After those 15 minutes, we are going to open discussions, debates with commentaries, questions that you have about Dr. Joaquín's presentation. And I will also ask that during the session about questions, you raise your hands on the reactions so we can see who has the doubts and questions so we can organize in a sequential way. And with that being said, I'll give the stage to Dr. Joaquín. Thank you so much for being here. And I hope this will be a very interesting presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Maria Joao, for the invitation. I have to apologize, first of all, because I think that my level of English is not as good as yours. I try to do my best, but if any moment you don't understand what I'm trying to say, just please let me know and we will find to make me more understandable if possible. I think that my English and my Portuguese also is kind of oxidated, especially after this year in lockdown. So as you said, I will try to map some of the debates. I will not pretend to be all-inclusive and comprehend all the debates, but at least most of them, I will try to be at least give you an idea of most of the topics that are being discussed in the relation between these two concepts, environment and. I will try to use a PowerPoint presentation if it's up to you. So I will share my desk. Let me try to do it. So if I did it properly, you should be watching a PowerPoint presentation. Is that right?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, thank you very much. So As you said, I'm working at the University of the Balearic Islands, but in particular, I'm a member of the Interdisciplinary Lab on Climate Change, which is a pioneer institution in Spain where experts and scholars from different fields try to work in so important problem, which is climate change. Most of the members of this lab are coming from natural sciences, and as you can imagine, in fact, I'm actually the only one coming from humanities. Some other colleagues from social sciences, like geography or economy, but I'm the only one coming from humanities. So my experience in this field is that humanities and social sciences have a lot to say about this problem, but it's very challenging to do it among scientists. And somehow you have to be familiar with their approaches and data and models to understand what is being asked. So just as a sort of introduction, in last decades have developed, has developed a new field in practical philosophy, moral philosophy, political philosophy, social philosophy, and in political theory around what is called ethics and politics of the environment. Particularly in some Anglo-Saxon countries like United Kingdom or Australia or in Germany, there's a long tradition for at least 3-4 decades of people working in this field. They have a sound bibliographical apparatus. Last decade, the priority focus is on the ethics and politics of climate change. Today, it seems that everything has to do with climate change, and the rest of environmental problems or challenges are estimated somehow. So I will focus my presentation particularly in climate change. Justice, the concept of justice, somehow encompasses the moral, ethical, political dimensions. So this is the main reason why I chose this term, justice. In particular, in green political thought, there's a massive evidence coming from sociology and political science stating that green political thought is based on 3 main values. One of them is what make this tradition different from the rest. Some scholars have ended that in fact we can talk about a specific political ideology that is different from the rest because of a sort of nuclear value around sustainability or the defense of natural values. But beyond this, there's a lot of evidence, as I said, that there are at least 2 other values that somehow identify this tradition. Democracy, and the other one is justice. So justice is not unfamiliar in this tradition. It's not an alien in these discussions, although most of the work done in this field is focused more on the idea of sustainability or natural values. There's a massive bibliography on these fields, in particular in Anglo-Saxon countries, and in particular coming from the United Kingdom and Australia, as I said. The main authors in this tradition are coming from those countries. So, taking into account that this is my field, I will try to present these debates restricted to this field. There are so many other questions that I don't have time and probably knowledge to present to you. So I will try to organize my presentation in 4 parts. I will make some preliminary considerations first. Secondly, I will give a general idea about the actions around justice and the environment in general terms, in particular in three different axes: intergenerational, and what is usually called interspecific species. But it will be more correct to say that this is a non-anthropocentric approach or an interspecific. So this will be the part of my presentation. And the third part, what I would like to focus, if I have time to do it, on justice around climate. I will try to give examples of different things that I will present in the second part in more detail in this third part. And in particular, I will try to present some, maybe the most of the main principles that are discussed and applied in real politics in climate justice. And finally, I will try to make a sort of final consideration about some other non-distributive approaches, because most of the discussion is centered on distribution, and in fact will be framed in the presentation around distribution. So as this preliminary consideration, first of all, there's a discussion. The discussion is, why do we have to care about environmental problems? Why do we have to accept that there is something like an environmental crisis and we have to do a bit of nothing? So we have to say that there is a big discussion on that, and the mainstream, I would say the dominant view, in particular in institutions, not in the academy, I would say in the social and political and economic institutions, what it's called the BAU, or the business as usual approach, or politics. So there's nothing better we can do than doing the same we have been doing for decades. This long period that started with the Industrial Revolution. Some of the tenets or the positions that are used, the arguments that are used to defend this business as usual approach, is to deny that there is something like a climate crisis or environmental crisis, and in particular that there is no scientific consensus on that. I suppose that you are familiar with this idea, Donald Trump, the nihilist. Somehow everybody knows about that, people like Donald Trump. And another argument is that we don't have to worry because technology will provide, technology will find solutions for that, in particular geoengineering, which is something where a lot of funding is being put today in order to improve and create new technologies of environmental problems, in particular climate change. There's a well, I say a permanent use of this third argument, is that we have no duties for distant others, for distant generations, for future generations, as far as there's no reciprocity between generations. We don't have to do anything for future generations as far as they will do nothing for us. We'll come back to this later. Another argument is that in global terms, in holistic approach, there's a positive balance of cost and benefits if we take into account what development and conventional growth is doing for people and for the environment, compared to the harms that environmental crisis to do. And another argument is the non-observance problem. Maybe it's familiar to you. Donald Trump was very combative on that. He repeated that the United States had no obligation against or in front of climate change because China did nothing, for instance. And why we as European should be proactive and put a lot of money against environmental problems if the United States doesn't, or if China doesn't. In response to this kind of first problems, there are used different sort of arguments that are aimed at justifying some sort of duties, maybe negative or positive, or both. The first one is that even if there's no scientific consensus, the best knowledge that we have today in relation to environmental crisis is based on the greatest scientific enterprise in history. Is science, the soundest science in history behind the data, models, and knowledge we have around environmental problems, and in particular climate change. And that denialist has nothing to offer at that level. Another argument is that scientific uncertainty, in fact, should trigger a precautionary attitude, precautionary stance in front of environmental problems, instead of promoting a sort of Marie Antoinette approach. In any case, there are strong material certainties, in particular in what is called double injustice in relation to environmental problems. The double injustice is that industrial societies were from the very beginning the most benefit and responsible of climate crisis and environmental problems in general terms, and that in current days, nowadays, these inequalities are being increasing day by day. I will give you some examples later on. On the other hand, it's argued that this is more an ethical stance, that there's no way to avoid applying something similar to John Stuart Mill harm principle, in the sense that it's very difficult to justify not to take into account and not being responsible for the actions that we are doing that harm somehow someone. So this is something that we have to take into account. This is, I mean, the first part of my presentation. This sort of preliminary discussions in order to understand later on the details, because from many different positions, social, political, economic positions, the rest of what I'm going to discuss has no sense as far as you, first of all, justify why do we have to be proactive in our responsibility to other in relation to climate change. So I would say that the sort of commonplace, I wouldn't say a consensus, but a sort of commonplace in this discussion, it's defended the necessity of apply the precautionary principle. I suppose that you're familiar to it. There are many different versions of it, and in some cases, legally implemented, legally enacted. One of the definitions says something like that: when an activity raises threats, harms to human health or the environment, precautionary measures should be taken, even if some cause and effect relationships fully established scientifically. In this context, the proponent of an activity, rather than the public, should bear the burden of proof. It's more or less what I said. It's more difficult to justify in current discussion why not to act. The opposite. What is important is that one of the most important contemporary philosophers, and I'm sure that you are more familiar, you are totally familiar with him, with his roles, is usually used in this discussion. I will go into details of that later on, but the point is that there is a kind of agreement in accepting that somehow the maximum principle, as it was used by Rawls, can be understood as a sort of version of this precautionary principle. You are familiar with this idea. The maximum rule tells that we have to rank alternatives to different societies or basic just structures societies by their worst possible outcomes. We are to adopt the alternative, most outcome of which is superior to the worst outcome. I will give you an example of that on my point. So the point is that somehow there is a strong connection, conceptual connection between these two principles. One coming from philosophy, the other coming from real politics or politics, in the sense that we have to put ourselves in the worst position, in the worst scenario. It means trying to avoid some harms, even if they are not likely. So I start with the second part now, and I will give you some ideas about these discussions in the different axes I mentioned before. I start with the intergenerational approach, framed in a domestic, in a national Westphalian field. Here, the use of roles or some specific interpretations of Rawls' political philosophy is mainstream. Not only is a commonplace, but mainstream. So try to imagine the discussions within a Rawlsian framework, in the domestic framework, called the liberal society. And the first problem which is discussed is if the relation to the environment has to do with justice, or if it's just it's not just something related to private interests and preferences, something that has to do with private life, not with politics. Today, the trend is to accept that it has to do with justice. So it means that the basic structure of society has to be modified to integrate these problems and duties derived from justice. But not everybody is agreeing with this position. There are some others that think that this is something that relates to private life. How do you value nature for future generation? Well, one of the strategies to deal with these problems is trying to apply the equality principle. So it means that the environment has to be thought as something that should be equally shared among citizens in a well-ordered society and a liberal society. In this case, there are two different, say, strategies. One is considering that at least nature in the sense that it's life supporting systems, is usually called critical natural capital, is a precondition of existence. In that sense, it should be guaranteed for everybody. Pay attention on that. I'm not saying that nature in any of the senses that its work can have could be understood under the equality principle. Nature as it has to do with life supporting systems. The second strategy has to do with the application, the implementation of the equal opportunities principle of the equal. In this case, it is considered that the environment is a precondition of human rights, something like health or physical integrity. These are words that Rawls himself used in these discussions. And that the protection of the environment is important in the sense that a difference in the access to the environment, to an environment of quality, generate disadvantages between groups and individuals. Another strategy within this equal opportunities principle is uses the argument that at least what is called irreversible nature, nature that cannot be replaced, substituted, or created if you destroy it, think for instance of biodiversity, is a precondition for basic liberty, such as aesthetic appreciation of nature, scientific research, recreation and leisure. Usually Rawlsians in these discussions think that this is one of the most useful strategies to have, let's say, ambitious idea of protecting nature. That it's not necessary to suppose that the environment has to be faced from the equality principle. And directly, from this equal opportunities principle, we can do even more to protect the environment, and assuming that has to do with basic or human rights. The same, this idea that an indirect strategy is more intelligent, is used when discussing the third, I would say, Rawlsian principle, just savings principle that Rawls, as you know, developed to deal with the problem of justice between generations. Someone like Marcel Wissenburg, which is one of these, I would say, eco-Rawlsians, use this expression, states that if we take into account the right for future generations, for health, the right to scientific knowledge, research, aesthetic appreciation of nature, as a whole, the right of future generations to follow their chosen life plans implies a very restricted protectionist approach to it. As far as any distraction that we will do in our current generation will decrease the chances of future generations to follow the life plan. Finally, there's another discussion around the difference principle. So it means that in that sense, nature, understood more as natural, non-critical resources, can be unequally distributed, actually, today. But in that case, the unequal distribution of the environment as natural, non-critical resources would be in favor of the most disadvantaged. So this is more or less the general discussions that we can find in this Rawlsian approach from an intergenerational and anthropocentric point of view, obviously. The point is that many authors think that we have to go beyond Rawls for many reasons. One of the reasons is that environmental crisis cannot be understood unless we adopt a transnational global point of view. In fact, the Rawlsian idea of a well-ordered society is very controversial. I will give you some examples right now. The point is that there's a huge correlation, a huge coincidence between what are supposed to be these liberal well-ordered Rawlsian societies with industrialized, richest societies, which have the most important environmental impact, most biggest ecological footprint. In fact, it states that what Rawls calls a sense of justice in a well-ordered society is the sense of justice typical of a wealthy society, based on a sort of eco-colonialism or an unequal distribution of environmental resources, goods, services in a global scale. Simon Hellwood added a very interesting critique to this Rawlsian idea of the sense of justice in the world order society. He would say that, in fact, the Rawlsian approach assumes a comprehensive doctrine, not only a political idea of justice, in the sense that it is anthropocentrist, that it assumes nature as goods and services instrumental to human. And this is a comprehensive doctrine, as he said. Some other, in fact, this is a commonplace in social sciences, environmental social sciences, in fact, it is stated that comprehensive, dominant, hegemonic comprehensive doctrine in society, in rich societies, are fossilism, or what was called last decades industrialism, consumerism, productivism, as a sort of ideology or comprehensive doctrine, massive consensus, based on an unequal distribution of natural resources, goods and services around the world and between generations. So in that case, it's unavoidable to think of justice in global terms and to think what would be good global justice principles. I will not go into details in that now, because I will put some specific examples related to climate politics. One of the most, I would say, the most ambitious principle on that is been proposed by Peter Singer, the Australian philosopher. For sure you know of him. It is global egalitarianism. It means that the access to the environment should be distributed as a sort of equal access to a sustainable and equal share of nature for everyone. These are some examples that I mentioned before. I suppose that you are familiar with this idea of the ecological footprint. It was proposed 2 decades ago by Matthijs Bakker-Nagel, and now is very popular around the world. So it's an approximation. It's a sort of way of representing the impact of an individual, a group, a society, a country, a continent. And this is the world, the global evolution of global footprint. And this sort of pink part of the graph expresses the overshoot, let's say the share of nature which shouldn't be consumed or destroyed if we take into account future generations, how we are consuming future with that. And unless we fit our consumption of nature, of the environment, beneath this green line, we cannot say that we are being just in intergenerational and global terms. Here you have the evolution of this overshoot, the excess of ecological footprint of the Portuguese society. This is your ecological footprint in national. The Spanish will be roughly the same, so don't feel bad about that. I go back to this idea of a well-ordered society in a Rawlsian approach. Here we have a graph correlating wealth, GDP, measuring GDP, and the ecological footprint. So we have that most of the richest societies are the most, the less ecological societies around the world. Strong correlation between development and the ecological footprint. And there is also a big correlation with democracy. Most destroying societies from an environmental point of view are the oldest democracies. Some specific exception like India, but there is a strong correlation in that. So it's not that crazy, it's not that unrealistic to think that somehow this Rawlsian idea of well-ordered society has to do with the material requirements that our democracies consumed in order to have what Rawls would call just structure of society. Here we have another graph which is expressing more or less the same. Strong correlation between the countries with the highest human development index, we would say the most developed countries, ecological footprints. From the intergenerational axis, the discussions are, some of the discussions are as follows. First problem is what Derek Parfit called the non-identity problems. Why do we have to be worried to assume that we have duties to future generations that would not exist if we behave differently? From a literal interpretation of this non-identity problem is follow the non-action, the business as usual approach. Another problem is the representation. How do we represent future generations? There are different countries like Wales or Hungary or Japan that have created specific committees to represent future generations. And one of the most important authors in this field, Andrew Dobson, defended that national parliaments should have a specific quota of representative for members of environmental NGOs in order to represent future generations. But this is a huge problem from at least from philosophical point of view. Another problem which is related with the earlier one is how many future generations do we have to represent? What sort of discount rate should we apply? Which is the same of saying that how do we value the interest of future generations? The preferred solution to this sort of big problems is that if we assume a strong sustainability approach, which means that we assume a weak substitutability approach to the environment, we assume applying the precautionary principle that is not easy and is not clever to believe that we can substitute most of environmental goods and services. For the sake of current generation, we will preserve the rights of future generations. So this is a kind of non-direct, indirect way to defend the rights of future generations by the interest of current generation. There's another problem which is not that common in this discussion, but to me this is important, which is past generations. What happened with past generations if we think in intergenerational terms, the relation between justice and the environment? Some authors like Joan Martínez-Alier, a very influential economist, defended this idea of the ecological debt, so that these well-ordered societies were based somehow in a history of eco-colonialism that create a duty for the current generation in unequal terms. So that the most responsible societies for the historical of the environment or historical emissions that provoke climate change as a debt differential debt. It is stated, as you can imagine, that past generations didn't know about climate change, that they have ignorance enough not to assume any sort of duty. And Wilfred Beckerman, a very influential economist, insists in this idea of non-reciprocity that I mentioned before. There's no reason to assume duties for future generations, as far as they will do nothing for us. The last axis in this sort of map I'm trying to sketch has to do with the environment or with nature in a very different way. I've been assuming a sort of anthropocentric approach until now, so far. I assume that when we talk about justice and the environment, we are in fact assuming that the duties are only directed to human beings, and the nature is a sort of mediation between human beings, are resources or goods or services to human beings. But there is a strong and long tradition defending the idea that we are due of justice to nature, that nature deserves justice even when there is no instrumental use, prudential use, or interest of human beings. The key category, the key concept on this discussion is the idea that nature, or some specific parts of nature, has intrinsic value, and value that it is not derivative from other values or from human interest. One of the problems you can imagine is what entities should deserve from human beings. There are a way of organizing this, the different approaches to this problem. The holistic approach focuses on holistic entities like ecosystems, biomasses, biomass, I would say, sorry, species, the earth as a whole, entities which are wholes in that sense. Some other approaches focus on individuals, are atomistic, that more than taking into account this sort of systems or holistic entities, think of specific individuals, in particular animals, which is the mainstream approach to this problem. Now the question is, why do we have to assume duties to nature? And I would say that the most influential argument was defended by, proposed initially by us. The entities that are autopoietic, that have a good of their own, deserve justice from human beings. I would say that this is the most influential position, stands in particularly in environmental ethics, which is a specific in these discussions. As I said, the individualistic atomistic approach is prevalent. The idea that entities that deserve justice have a good of their own. So somehow these discussions lead to the focus on species and animal species in particular, and individuals also, more than holistic entities. Then you can imagine the discussion goes from assuming that we are obliged to behave in just terms to non-human animals in general, to just sentient animals. This is Peter Singer approach, for instance, just to create apes. But some others defend, some other authors defend something similar that I mentioned before for the rest of the act. the idea that if we defend holist entities, in an indirect way, we will defend individual entities. Edward Wilson, the father of the sociobiology, one of the most influential biologists ever, I would say, defend this proposal of half Earth, which is to leave half of the Earth untouched in order to create connections between different biomes, in different habitats of biodiversity, and that this will be in interest of the human beings. Let's think, for instance, as the current pandemic we are suffering these days, the coronavirus. The coronavirus emerged in a process of transfer of viruses from non-human species to human species, what is called zoonosis. And that is related to the loss of biodiversity and the destruction of natural habitats, particularly in Asia. So preserving these habitats will be in the benefit of human beings, will be in the benefit of holistic entities like biomases or species, but also in the benefit of individuals. I mean, specific individuals in any of these species that will be benefited from preserving half Earth for non-human life. Well, I will say something on justice related to climate change. I will try to be brief and just to give you some examples of some principles of justice applied to the environment in a particular case, which is climate change, and some of the things that I mentioned before, just as list of examples. But this is a typical graph from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is an institution created in the 90s. When it was created, the International Framework on Convention for Climate Change under the umbrella of the United Nations. And here we have some future scenarios according to different amounts of emissions of greenhouse gases. The red one is the worst case scenario, and the blue one is the best case scenario. This is the best one is which is supposed to follow the Paris Agreement that was enacted 5 years ago. So adopting a precautionary principle approach, or a Rawlsian maximum principle approach, we will have to take into account the interest of the worst position in the worst scenario. I would say the best position in the worst scenario. So it means that we have to try to avoid any scenario that puts the most disadvantaged group in the worst position. So obviously we should have to try to arrive to get the best scenario, which is the blue one, which is supposed to be what Paris Agreement is trying to achieve. So the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change use this term in particular, climate justice. So this term is not only a philosophical or theoretical discussion, but implemented in politics, in real politics. And in the preamble of this convention, we have this idea. Acknowledging that the global nature of climate change calls for the widest possible cooperation by all countries and the participation in an effective and appropriate international response in accordance with the common but differentiated responsibilities and respective abilities and the social and economic conditions. So how do we deal from a say, theoretical, philosophical, analytical point of view, with this idea of differentiated responsibilities and respective. How do we implement these ideas that you can imagine that are very controversial and are open to different interpretations, actions, taking into account the different taxes that I mentioned before? Well, we have to say that, first of all, the mainstream approach in order to interpret this idea is anthropocentric, is transnational, so the Rawlsian approach is limited to face the problem, and is related not only to theory, not only to academic discussions, but to real politics also. The different principles I will mention very, very briefly right now has been used by different countries or coalition of countries in the negotiations and in the bargaining within the different international summits that currently take place every year. The Conference of the Parties is called, under this umbrella of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So the point is that this problem is faced also from a distributive point of view. The problem is, how do we distribute the burden of climate action? I mean, distributing the share of emissions that can be allowed from different point of view to the different actors that in this case are thought as states, as national states. So I will present very briefly these different principles, just to give you a glimpse or a general idea of the discussions that are mainly these five. There is a increasing literature on these discussions, and there are other principles that are being discussed, but I would say that these are the more important. And I present them from the most ambitious to the less ambitious. So I will start with this emissions egalitarianism, which is somehow, as I mentioned before, found in Peter Singer's work. The idea is to calculate somehow what's the total budget that the total budget of emission that the climate can, say, afford not to destabilize, and how do we share this total budget, sustainable budget, among human beings, among states. So the idea from this principle is that we have to share an equal and sustainable share among human beings, and that we should converge, departing from the current situation, which is obviously unequal, to a future situation in which this share was equally distributed on human beings. The aim of this principle is to achieve mitigation, and I have to say something about that. Let me introduce a footnote on this discussion. 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, climate politics was thought around three different values or ideas. Prevention, so the idea was avoiding climate change. Mitigation, which is avoiding the worst harms coming from climate change. And adaptation, just adapting to climate change as it is. Today, no one defends prevention. There's a sort of scientific consensus, very recent, from last decade, that climate change will happen in any case, and that for centuries we will have climate change, like it or not. So the focus is put on the more, let's say, progressive approaches or ambitious approaches in mitigation, and the less ambitious approaches put the focus on just adaptation. Well, this emissions egalitarianism assume that the atmosphere, nature as a whole, but the atmosphere in particular, is a common public good. Every human being somehow has the right to own in equal terms this common public good. That there are differentiated responsibilities in order to act, to be proactive of the climate change, but it's unfair to compensate for past generations, for past emissions, sorry. It means that present generation has not inherited the duty for what our ancestors did. And that departing from the current situation, which is an unequal distribution of access to the atmosphere, I mean, in the fact that there is a big difference in emissions depending how do you live and where do you live. But departing from this unequal distribution, we should converge in this sort of total sustainable budget, sharing an equal right to the atmosphere, so an equal right to an equal share of emissions. Well, this principle was implemented by the United Kingdom. So this is not only a theoretical discussion. The United Kingdom government enacted different laws and decrees to apply a transition plan against climate change based on this principle, but in a national scale, obviously. Well, the second principle, I'm sure that you are familiar with this, is the polluter pays principle. This is the preferred principle, or it was the preferred principle for the European Union for decades in this negotiation on the climate governance regime. Well, you know, it means that who lives by the sword will die by the sword. You have to pay what you do, something like that. And that the responsibilities we have are proportional to emissions. And who is responsible, obviously, is those who are responsible for creating climate change. The aim is to compensate in justice, assuming differentiated differentiated responsibilities that has to do with the past. And this is different from the previous principle. So historical emissions create a differential duty in order to cut emissions, in order to cut or mitigate climate change. But historical emissions do not create or do not legitimate the current nowadays advantage. And that must be leveled through financial means in most of the cases in the transition to cut emissions. So in the distribution of the future cost of mitigations. The third principle, I'm saying first, second, third, as I mentioned before, as a sort of hierarchy coming from the most ambitious to the less ambitious. This is the beneficiary pays principle. It's very similar to the previous one, but instead of assuming the responsibility has to do with emission, has to do with the benefit taken from emission. This principle has been defended very, very hard by Russia and its allies, its co-alligates in the negotiations in the climate change governance regime. They say something like this. Okay, we were big. We were a big industrialized society. Our historical emissions were big, but as far as we suffer a sort of deindustrialization when the Soviet regime collapsed, we didn't get such a big benefit from emissions as, for instance, the United States. So we shouldn't be concerned that big responsibles of that, as far as we didn't benefit for that. So they assume that they are differentiated responsibilities that create a duty to compensate from the past. So far, it's very similar to the previous principle, but that this compensation is related to the benefit, the emissions. So it shouldn't be calculated in physical terms, in tons of emissions, but in economic terms. Rich you are, as far as you were polluted. Well, the fourth principle is called the ability to pay principle, and it's also similar to the previous one, but here the responsibilities are related to wealth, are proportional to wealth. These responsibilities, so how do we should cut our emissions, is proportional to how rich we are, to each actor's economic purchasing power. The point is that in this principle in particular, but also on the previous principles, it is assumed that this budget is obviously fitted, adjusted to what a stable climate can assume, that there is a cap, a threshold that shouldn't be overpassed. And the last principle, that is called grandfathering in the literature in English, and in French is called d'antériorité. In Spanish, and I would say that in Portuguese, it should be called something like principio de dispensa, principio de exención. It's very, very interesting because it's sort of counterintuitive, at least for people, me coming from moral and political philosophy, but has been broadly used in the European Union and in particular in Spain. It says something like that: to those who have, more shall be given. As you know, it sounds like the St. Matthew's rule. The idea is that past emissions and title create a right for future emissions. So that traditional rights, consuetudinary rights, are inherited from past emissions. As far as we did it in the past, and it was not a problem, as far as we have some expectations about our future life based on what we did on that past, we have the right to do the same in the future. So it means that you have more rights to meet as you did emissions in the past. It doesn't mean that emitters, big industrialized countries have no responsibilities, no obligations, but their obligations are fewer than, or at least proportional than the rest of the countries. This is a shocking principle to me. When I found it in the literature, I was very surprised. But in fact, it was implemented by most of the European countries, and in particular Spain. When the European Union distributed the shares of future emissions under a cap, under a specific cap or threshold that was implemented according to the Kyoto Protocol years ago, about a decade ago. Only in Germany, these shares were distributed according to some other principles. The rest of European countries distributed the share according to this grandfathering principle. It meant that our governments gave this share to corporations, economic sectors, and industries in proportion to what they did in the past by free. They didn't have to pay for that. It was a sort of windfall profit. It was given in proportion to historical emissions from these sectors. It led to very surrealistic situations. For instance, what happened in Spain is that most of these permits of these shares were given by free to the cement and the ceramic sectors. And they were given in proportion to historical emissions. But when they received these permits, it was in the middle of the financial crisis 10 years ago. So it meant that these sectors didn't need those shares because their economic activity was not the same as big as it was 20 years ago. So they could send by thousands of millions of euros in the international markets for emission permits, something that was given by free by states according to this principle. Well, final considerations, and I think that I have to finish right now. So these discussions, in particular in climate change politics, normally, usually assume some sort of preconceptions. One is that when they talk about cost, they are thinking about economic cost, economic expenditures, so that somehow we have to compensate by paying. Someone has to compensate others by historical emissions, for instance, or for wealth inequalities, it has to be traduced to money. It's also assumed a very unrealistic, today, a very unrealistic idea that cost derived from climate governance do not affect gross national product in negative terms, but that we can grow as we did for decades, and at the same time we can assume our responsibilities in climate policy. Dominique Rosset and Christian Seidel, we have an impressive book on this field. I will give you the reference in a few minutes. State something like that, which this idea to me, this sentence to me expresses what I just said. Those who caused the damage must pay for it, pay money for it. Otherwise, conventional development takes priority. I would say that this is a very unrealistic approach. The egalitarian principle, the first principle that I presented, tend to be considered annoying, a very uncomfortable principle. The most controversial of them. And although we have some examples, as I say, United Kingdom implemented it, in the global discussions, in the summits on climate change, only NGOs defend this sort of thing. Any of those principles that I presented, success, performance depends on how ambitious is the cap, and what sort of priority is given to the cap, to the emissions cap, in relation to other values like economic growth. Usually, different principles are combined. This is called principles or principle pluralism. For instance, the European Union politics uses different principles in different specific fields of the government. Is what's related to climate justice. So now I will give you just some final considerations on environmental justice in general terms. I tried, I'm not sure if I achieve it, but I tried to exemplify, to put some examples of some environmental justice problems, in particular in the case of climate governance. But as final considerations, I would say that first of all, this distributive approach is pretty limited. We have to take into account some of the values and not only distribution. And we have to think in particular about legitimacy, participation, representation, deliberation. One value, obviously, that we should take into account is participation and participatory justice. Let's think about the global summits on climate change, for instance, around 80% of the participants, of the members in these summits are men, male, not women. But there's sociological evidence that women tend to be more sensitive towards the environment. Women should be more proactive and more responsible. But they are obviously underrepresented in these national forums. Another important question to take into account is which should be the criteria. Should we be participating or represented in these international forums or arenas in relation to environmental governance? Usually we assume a sort of Habermasian principle of all affected. Some other authors, like for instance, Nancy Fraser, the American philosopher, Nancy Fraser is defending the all subjective principle. It means that not everyone should be considered affected by environmental problems. Only those that are affected by problems, some specific problems in a systemic, structural way. For instance, according to Fraser, we should divide environmental problems in different fields. For instance, biodiversity, climate change, water, pollution, acidification of oceans, and take into account the relevant voices as they are subjected to those specific fields, but not everyone, not every group or every human being. Well, as I mentioned, the climate governance regime is a specific example, is a very good example of democratic deficits in terms of participation in climate or environmental governance in general terms. Not only women are underrepresented, but all countries are underrepresented. Corporations are overrepresented. Usually nations directly defend the position of some specific, somehow national corporations. The voice of the NGOs, which are supposed to be the most representative voices of the collectives affected by environmental problems, are also underestimated, underrepresented in these forums. We could add some other examples of that. Some other authors, and this is something that is being developed last years, but is just at the beginning. I would say that the distributive approach is still the mainstream approach, clearly. Talk about recognition as a value to environmental justice. Some others talk about transitional justice. This is, in fact, taken into account in climate justice, as I tried to show. Some others talk about restorative justice, and this is a non-anthropocentric point of view in most of the cases. They defend that we are obliged to improve the environment and improve nature or the habitat for some specific. And the last one is what I would call discursive justice. For instance, why do we talk about climate change? 3 decades ago, the term was climate crisis, not climate change, or environmental, global warming. The normative charge, the semantic content of global warming is different from that of climate change and of that of climate crisis. Why do we think of climate crisis particularly in terms of technological substitution, reduction of emissions through technological substitution, what is called decarbonizing? Why do we talk in these terms? The way in which we participate in global, national, and what is called green public spheres is very important also to me in order to take into account this relationship between justice and the environment. Words are not innocent. And this is something that usually is underestimated, at least on the literature on climate justice. So that's all. I hope that you could understood more or less my poor English, my Spanglish. I finished just with some suggested readings. There are a huge literature on that, but I will recommend you, if you are interested in these discussions, this collection of essential readings by Stephen Gardiner, Climate Ethics, Essential Readings. This very clear, very pedagogical book by Dominique Rosset and Christian Seidel, Climate Justice, an introduction. Although I disagree with some of the assumptions, I think that this is a book that we have translated in our languages, and a classic taking into account not only climate change, but justice and environment in general terms. Magnificent book by Andrew Dobson, Justice and the Environment. So I will stop sharing my presentation with you, and this is what I prepare.
Thank you very much, Dr. Joaquín. It was a very fruitful presentation. I hope you all enjoyed it. Now, it is open the session for questions or commentaries that you have for Dr. Joaquín. I would like to ask you to raise your hands on the reactions on down there. For those who have any questions or commentaries for the professor. No one has any questions? No comments?
So I was so boring.
No, actually, I have
nothing.
I have one. I can start then. I have just one question. With the increasing nowadays, with the increasing importance and especially support for populist parties, especially right-wing populists, and usually I believe that populists, especially on the right wing, are a bit skeptical about climate change, environmental politics in general, and climate justice as well. So can we say, is it possible that the increasing support for populism means that climate justice cannot be attained? Do populists support each one of those climate justice principles?
Well, there's someone working specifically on that. I can't remember her name. She's a woman in Germany working on the right-wing populist approach to environmental justice and climate justice in particular. And I would say that the denialist approach was overwhelming 2 decades ago. I made a research on that, and I found a work by two political scientists that studied how the right-wing populist movements at that time we didn't use the term populist, right-wing politics, were supported by big corporations funding the denial movement, in particular in the United States. So at that time, in this, I would say, right-wing part of the political spectrum, the denialist approach was overwhelmingly dominant. But I think that today is not the case. Even though we can see people like Donald Trump, which obviously is nihilist, or Orban in Hungary, more difficult today to find in the right-wing politics, not in the populist right-wing politics, but in right-wing politics in general terms, a denialist stance. For instance, 15 years ago, the most important right-wing party in Spain, the Popular Party, the PP, I suppose that you heard of José María Aznar, for instance, no? That was president of
Yes.
legislatures, were denialist. And it was the same in Italy and in France, everywhere. And today, these, I would say, more conventional right-wing parties try to avoid the nihilist stance. It doesn't mean that they support climate governance, not at all. But I would say that the discussion in the global public sphere last 2 decades, meant the victory of the scientific community over the nihilists. And accepting these some specific radical populist stances, to me, is difficult to find conservative visions all around the world today, saying that there's nothing like climate change. Scientific evidence is so massive, so sound, that it's very difficult to deny that. Well, this is my opinion. I'm not expert on that. This is just, I would say, an improvised consideration. So basically, I don't know, what do you think? Change. I don't know if you agree.
No, I think climate change nowadays is inevitable. So it's a topic that is inevitable to discuss. And I do believe that the nihilistic views on the conservative parts, well, as you said, they may not support climate governance, but they know that climate change is real, and they try well, they do not say as much, they do not express as much as, let's say, for example, left parties or ecological parties, but they recognize some of those. Yes, and I do believe that the nihilistic view is more reserved to more skeptical parties or politicians or even citizens who support them, compared at least to in the past. Yes. So anyone have more questions, comments to this topic? No? Well, I think if no one has any questions, Antimio has a question. Please, Antimio.
Yes, it's sorry about the video. First of all, hello to all the attendees and participants in this conference. My name, as you see, is Antimio Damião. I'm a philosophy graduate by the Nova University of Lisbon, and I'm attending the first year of a master's course in political science in the University of Beira Interior. Well, my two questions can probably seem a little bit complex and at the same time a bit naive. But given the necessity of environmental politics nowadays, is there still a plausible way for nations and governments worldwide to promote green politics without imposing them on the masses by means of coercive or even force measures, like, for example, as I've recently read on the news, more sporadic lockdowns? And if so, can our not always fair, ethical, and democratic society promote those politics without changing drastically and dramatically our capitalist way of life? Thank you. That's all.
Well, very tricky questions. Well, the first, I don't think they are naive at all, these questions. I think that they are becoming more important year by year. Well, from the very beginning of green politics in the 60s, and in particular during the 70s, it was proposed this idea of eco-authoritarianism. And some very influential biologists that were activists, that were ecologists at the same time, defended the need of coercive authoritarian policies in order to implement a green agenda. So they thought, more or less as I presented in my presentation, that I defended, they thought that the connection between industrialism and democracy is so strong they assume that we, as citizens of the most privileged societies on history in material terms, we are, there's no doubt, are so benefited from industrial society, from fossilism, that there's no way we can think differently. This is, even though this idea came from natural scientists, it's a sort of Marxian, classical Marxian materialistic approach to that. Or your conscious is performed somehow by your way of living. Your social being determines your ideas. They thought that we cannot imagine a world without massive use of fossil fuels, of electricity, of hypermobility, fashions, and all these kinds of things we feel somehow natural for us. So they defended this idea of eco-fascism or eco-authoritarianism. And at that time, three decades ago, that idea was very influential in demographic politics. At that time, the focus in environmental problems was focused on overpopulation. Not usually the case today. Usually, in the list of environmental problems, population is not put on the first place today, but it was 3 decades ago. At that time, in some specific places, this argument was added to some other reasons to defend cohesive politics compatible with the great agenda, like decreasing population, for instance. So this is a problem. I don't know what to add about that. That's a problem. I don't think there's a magical formula, a magical recipe to solve this question. But as we know, coming from Portugal or from Spain, we suffer a dictatorship for decades and very close to us in historical terms. Authoritarian politics or regimes are very blind, are not sensitive at all to civil society. And the most important alarm mechanism we had last decades in environmental terms were social movements, green NGOs, green parties, green activists all around the world. So if you don't have strong democratic liberties, civil and political and social liberties, and a plural and strong civil society, I see no reason to trust in a non-democratic government, even though it will do almost nothing to implement a green agenda, as is usually the case today. So I think that we are, as you can imagine, we are doing almost anything to solve the climate change problem. As I mentioned before, decades ago, the discussion was prevention, mitigation, adaptation. Today is only mitigation and adaptation. I'm totally sure, 100% sure that in 2 decades, the discussion will be only about adaptation. I'm totally pessimistic about the future. But measures that will be taken in the future could be influenced by the data, the values, the principles, the experience, the experimentation with different sort of regulations and rules, ways of living, of consuming, that are being created in a, I would say, pluralistic and autonomous civil society. Even though today we don't see the fruits of a democracy in order to would say the fruit, the fruit, the outcome, or a positive outcome coming from democratic societies in order to deal with the green agenda. What will happen in the future will be fed by what is being experimented in democratic terms today. And on the other hand, as I said before, there's no reason to trust in authoritarian politics or government in order to deal with environmental problems or any sort of social problems in general. So the second point, well, there is a huge, solid, sound tradition in what is called Eco-Marxism or eco-socialism. I don't know if you're familiar with that. In particular, last years, there is a very important discussion in political theory and philosophy between authors like Jason Moore, I don't know if it's familiar to you, or Andreas Malm, about what's the legacy on Marxian and socialist tradition in order to deal with environmental challenge or problems, and what's the relationship between capitalism and environmental crisis. In fact, I used in my presentation this idea of fossilism, and authors like James Moore use the idea of fossil capitalism or carbo-capitalism. They say, these sort of authors say, the problem with the environment is not industrialism, it's not consumerism, it's not productivism, it's not the Anthropocene. I don't know if you heard of this idea. The problem is capitalism. To me, there's a problem in these discussions, but usually I'm not sure of what is meant by capitalism. Usually capitalism seems a way of life, a way of living, and style of life. Usually is a sort of mechanical, systemic structure where human, how can I say that? Human action is almost zero. Is a sort of big watch, autopoietically performing. I see no praxis in some of these definitions of capitalism. Sometimes capitalism is everything, and we have to take into account that non-capitalist societies were equally or even more destructive to the environment than capitalist societies. It was the case, for instance, in the Soviet Union. So I have this doubt. What do we have to mean by capitalism? But this was my first point. The second point is that, to me, there's no doubt that without another sort of economic system or mode of production, call it capitalism or carbo-capitalism or whatever, with a systemic change in the economic system, there's nothing to do in front of the environmental crisis. Capitalism is built on growth. Capitalism is based, you might know that, on, but these categories may sound familiar to you, is based on the perpetual increase of the social product. Capitalism is like a bike. It does not move, it falls down. The accumulative reproduction of capital is a prerequisite, is a condition of possibility of capitalism. And there's such a big correlation between economic growth as we know it and material, environmental, ecological consumption of nature that today is realistic to defend that we can grow without consuming nature. There's a theory defending that this is possible. This is called the theory of dematerialization. But there's no evidence that this is happening at all. It's happened only in very specific sectors in some specific moments. All or in national terms or in being the most important economic sectors in our societies, there's no way to think to be optimistic about this dematerialization. So the point is that growth means natural consumption, as we know it. And capitalism depends on growth. So I would agree with this idea that capitalism is not compatible with the green agenda. But we should go into details about what is capitalism, because we have a long history of non-capitalist societies that were very destructive of nature, modern and pre-modern. Well, I'm not sure if I'm giving you answers to your questions. This is more or less what I can say about that.
Yes, I agree with that, and just want to thank you for a little bit long answer, but kind of, I've understood most of it, most part of it. I understood, and I kind of feel the same way. I kind of feel the same way because if capitalism has to do with production and the environment has to do more with a form of conscience, in this case, an individual conscience of everyone, that's more even than with politics, I think. I don't know if you understood what I just am saying, but that's what I think.
Okay, so are there more questions or comments? Eduardo? Okay, Eduardo has a question, comment. Okay, Eduardo.
Estão a ouvir? Sim?
Sim,
Estão a
conseguimos
ouvir?
ouvir. Conseguimos ouvir, sim.
Well, my question is, if you don't think that in terms of causes by human activity, we should separate the environment preservation from the climate change, and also the consequences of that separation. Because for me, it's not clear that it's the climate change, and I think that the scientific opinion in this time that the climate change is not, it's not only about the human activity, but it is a natural phenomena. So I think that we should separate one thing from the other in terms of thinking about the consequences in terms of the political activity. What do you think about that?
Well, I will try not to give a so long answer to your question as I did before to Artemius. One. I have to say, and let me say that there is no animosity or hostility in my answer, but let me tell you that this is one of the arguments that the denialist movement is based on. The idea that climate change is a geological process and not an anthropogenic process. But the scientific evidence is very, very sound on that. The correlation between the change in the concentration of particles of greenhouse gases on the atmosphere and the historical emissions, almost one. And the correlation with the changes in temperature in global terms is almost one. Scientifically today, there is no other way to explain that correlation. This is the best science we have. As I mentioned before, this is coming from the biggest scientific enterprise ever. Something like the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, gathers thousands of the best scientists all around the world. And the process is so complex, is so strict. No one is doing something similar. No one can present such, how can I say, sound support for stating what's the origin of the climate change. In fact, we have now the same concentration of particles on the atmosphere that we had almost 1 million years ago. And during this period, the only massive geological change affecting the concentration of particles in the atmosphere is burning fossil fuels. I'm working, as I mentioned before, I'm working in this link at my university, this interdisciplinary lab on climate change. And you can find in this scientific community, because 90% of them are natural scientists, some of them involved in the IPCC. And for sure, in your country, in your universities, there are some natural scientists participating in the IPCC. This is a global scientific epistemic community. So in these scientists, you have people voting for right-wing parties, green parties, no voting at all. You have any sort of political stance represented. And some of them would like to deny climate change. But the scientific evidence is so strong that for me it's difficult not to accept that climate change is anthropogenic.
Sorry, I didn't introduce myself, but I am not a philosopher.
Natural scientist.
I am a natural scientist. So, I have my doubts because I worked in some models, and I'm aware of the models that are being used. And the models, as you see in your graphs, you have a latitude of values that is, it's great. It's not you cannot take a real conclusion from that values, okay? But I'm not a negationist. I think that is some issues with the human activity, but I think that that is to be added with the natural activity. Okay. So that is my aim, and I think that if we if you don't consider that there is that, of course there is any kind of other motives for this. Of course, you cannot answer to the question that if we differentiate the climate change from the environment preservation, you cannot talk about the second question. Okay, it's okay.
I didn't pretend to be rude.
No.
I can be wrong, obviously. I must be wrong.
No. I'm giving my what I think about I think that I'm not a negationist, and what I'm telling to you as a natural scientist, and knowing some of the models that those scientists use, I think that the certainty that they have, it's not very good, but okay. We are working. I myself work in a part of this when in the regarding the homes. I work with I don't know, maybe you don't know, but one of the most most of the CO2 emissions are from home activity. That's why in Europe we have now the thermal certification for the buildings, and I work on that. And I can assure you that the process that we use and the models that we use are not very, even very scientific, but okay. Thank
well,
you.
I used the graphs from the IPCC.
Yes. I'm aware of that. I know those graphs because I work with them.
You're an expert.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Angelo.
Sorry, it's possible, André Barata, because it's André.
So, but I would like to congratulate Joaquín for the very interesting presentation, and I wonder, and that's my question. I wonder, what would you think about degrowth proposals? Okay. Do you think degrowth proposals are a way to face a new paradigm of environmental justice or an ecological paradigm involving environment, but as well social and economic dimensions? I would like to listen a little bit about degrowth. What do you think about it? Or otherwise, do you think it's not a viable path for the future? What do you think about degrowth? I'm very curious, and thank you very much for your presentation.
Okay, you're welcome. I'm sorry if you have to leave right now. It's my fault because
No way.
I mean, I have a problem in English because I think I express myself very slowly. So I tend to, to say things in a very slow way and to consume a lot of time. It's my fault. So degrowth. Many things to say about that. I will try to be brief. This is a term that was used on the first place by André Gorz during the 60s, but during these 4 decades or 5 decades, it was not usual in environmental politics, not even in green movements. And I think that it has to do with the ambiguous semantic field of the term, because most of the green activists or movements will defend growing in schools, in health, in leisure time, in access to landscapes or nature or natural values. So the growth as a umbrella, it's a very risky strategy. But, well, this is my opinion, I'm not sure about that. But last years, in particular because of the work of Serre Latouche, the French sociologist, it became popular. And one of the most important degrowth or degrowist movements all around the world are in Italy and in Spain. So I don't know why, but in Latin countries, I don't know if it's the case in Portugal, but it succeeds in societies like ours. So maybe this is a sort of conceptual keyword for future green politics. The problem is, on the one hand, it's sort of semantic, lexic problem, if this is a good keyword or a green agenda or not, in a state of ability or zero growth. That was one of the terms used decades ago. This is one of the challenges. The other one is that it's very difficult in practical terms to defend a degrowth agenda today. We live in growth society, and we are experiencing still today what happened to a degrowth society without growth, which is what happened during the pandemic. So our state will face a massive debt because of the lockdown and the stopping in growing economy that we suffered last year. And the social cost, the increasing inequalities will be massive. So this is what happened when we have a growth society without growth. So it's very difficult to sell to the public opinion to the growth. But beyond the practical dimension and the lexical dimension, I would say that as far as this correlation between growth and material consumption of natural capitalism is so big that there's no way to face seriously environmental problems growing. The last thing I would say about that is that the progressive agendas in social democracy and the different versions of social democracy, today left-wing populism, you have in Portugal, or we have in Spain, from all democracy to including the social liberal politics, the third way politics, I mean, the whole spectrum of the left progressive agendas try to solve or try to mitigate inequalities through growth. Social democracy is based on the idea that growing, we can share in just terms, so we can distribute in just terms part of the social product. But this depends on growing. Oh, if we have to face seriously sustainability on the one hand and social justice on the other, without growth, the only way to build a progressive agenda is assuming that we will have to implement net distributions of wealth and properties. Net distribution, not the distributions based on the surplus, on the excedent, as the social democracy assumed. So it would not be a case of redistribution, but of distribution. Well, this is what can I say.
Thank you. Well.
Okay, so now I can give the word to Angelo because I guess he had a question.
Thank you, Angelo. Sorry.
No problem whatsoever. Well, let me just first of all thank you very much for your presentation, Professor Joaquín. I liked it very much. And my question, it falls a little far from the core of your presentation, but it can be articulated with Professor Andres' question as well, because it's going to be put more in the perspective of the public opinion and the public interpretation of the importance of a political agenda oriented towards the environment. My question here is, from what I understand, from what I know about the political way to implement a political agenda is still the same. I'm sorry, my dog is making a little bit of noise. It has been the same since the Hans Jonas writing of the principle of responsibility has been an heuristic of fear, and this heuristic of fear sometimes derives in an ideological polarization of the public's opinion. So the idea that to aim at a political agenda towards environment presupposes this degrowth, this stop in progress. How can we nowadays articulate the political agenda towards environmentalism with the agenda towards a progressive society based on technological progress nowadays? Something like this. Thank you very much.
Okay. I'm not sure if I understood properly your question. I see different things on that. I read Jonas' book, The Principle of Responsibility, and this idea of heuristic fear. Some people is arguing that climate change is playing this role, facing us, is putting us in front of a catastrophic scenario. And this is a sort of motivational device in order to be more ambitious in a green agenda. Some others argue that this is a counterproductive strategy. It's very difficult to mobilize public opinion under fear. And in particular, is if we create a sort of imaginary based on catastrophe. If you are sure that almost there is no solution like climate change in our countries, in 40 years, we will see restrictions in access to water, for instance, no? or temperatures similar to what it's now today in semi-arid areas, like north of Africa, like the Maghreb, for instance. No? This is what my colleagues, my scientific colleagues, are studying here in the Balearic Islands. No? So there's no reason to act. I mean, the chance that you can change something is so small that it's more rational to behave in conventional terms. So there's a discussion about that, and there is a movement trying to defend, let's say, a positive approach to a green agenda. You can be happy living with less. You can be happy given examples of alternative way of life, producing, consuming, working to the rest of society. So there's a discussion on that. There's a Portuguese philosopher. I knew him.
Viriato
Saromenho.
Marx.
Okay, I met him years ago in a PhD committee, and he was defending this idea that we are facing a sort of similar interaction framework that we had during the Cold War. That only fear, so for instance, the fear that capitalist countries had in front of a virtual socialist revolution, or the fear in front of atomic war, function efficiently to achieve some, let's say, social or progressive social. I'm not sure about that. And in fact, I think that there is an abuse of extreme catastrophic imagination facing climate change. As it was something that is going to happen suddenly and dramatically for everybody, that will be a democratic process. Everybody more or less the same. So I'm not sure about the power of these scenarios, but on the other hand, the most of the environmental problems are very easy to see and to experiment today, even for us living in some privilege in global terms. So it's difficult not to use this sort of motivational devices. I'm not sure if I answer. I'm sure, in fact, that I didn't answer your question. This is more or less what I could say if I understood you.
You answered it in a great extent, yes. But my core here was, in the public opinion, the interpretation that the public has of an environmentally friendly way of life creates a prejudice towards technological progress.
Okay, I missed that point.
How do they articulate? How can we create a speech or an idea or a concept that can articulate both to the public, so that they understand that through technological development, like Stigler defends, for example, through technological development, we may have an answer to the Anthropocene, for example, something like this.
Okay. I'm sorry, I missed that point. But there is no unique way of framing environmental problems in discursive terms in public opinion. You know, and there are many of them, plenty of them. There's an author, an Australian author, very interesting, John Drysack, how became expert on that, studying environmental discourses. There are many different of them. So some of them are, I could say, techno pessimistic or techno skeptical, but most of them are not. And I would say that the most important emerging green approach to environmental problems is pretty techno-optimistic, I would say. And we can see it in facing climate change. This sort of expectation that technological substitution will solve climate change using renewable energies instead of burning oil, these kind of things. I would say that this is becoming hegemonic. This sort of techno-optimistic approach to a post-carbon transition is based on trusting technology as such. I would say that.
Thank you very much.
Professor Maria, do you have?
I'm here. No, I think it's the time to close, because this is exploration of Joaquín.
No,
capitalist exploration from Portugal to Baleares.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Não sei, alguém tem uma questão mais? Somebody have a question? No. Okay. Joaquín, thanks very much for your exposition, very good exposition, and the clarification of the questions, very good. And welcome to these lectures. And I think in the different times you come to Covilhã.
I hope so.
I hope. And I think I don't know where is the conference in the Baleares? No conference, no.
I mean, we will like to organize a conference next year, around May, June, 2022. We organized huge conference, an international conference on moral and political philosophy here in Palma last May, in May 2012.
Okay.
And the pandemic destroyed 2 years of work and preparation of everything. So
yes, I know.
If everything goes well, we will organize, and you are more than welcome
yes.
to participate in this conference next year.
Well, thank you very much, Joaquín.
You're welcome. Obrigado.
Espera que eu... Okay. Não está.
Well, I guess the session...
Angelo? Diogo, say something. Thank you very much.
I was saying, I guess the session is now over. Thank you very much for allowing me to be the moderator, Professor. And so now we finish the session. Thank you so much, Joaquín, for your presentation, and thank you everyone for your participation.
Thank you, Diogo. Foi prazer.
Prazer, igualmente. Thank you very much, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.